The Ark of the Covenant stands as one of the most enigmatic and powerful symbols in biblical tradition, described in meticulous detail in the book of Exodus. This golden chest was said to contain the tablets of the Ten Commandments, a pot of manna, and Aaron's rod, but according to Scripture, it represented the very presence of God among the Israelites, a throne upon which the divine glory would manifest between two golden cherubim. The ark was so sacred that touching it meant instant death, and only the high priest could approach it once a year on Yom Kippur. But beneath this biblical narrative lies a tapestry of ancient symbols, mythological parallels, and esoteric meanings that connect the ark to far older pagan traditions. When we examine the ark through the lens of comparative mythology, we discover that its design, function, and symbolism echo sacred objects and concepts that predate the Exodus by thousands of years. These connections do not diminish the biblical account, but rather reveal how ancient Israel existed within a rich cultural context of Near Eastern religious thought, absorbing and transforming symbols that were already ancient when Moses received his divine instructions on Mount Sinai. The physical description of the ark itself provides our first clues to its deeper symbolic meaning. Made of acacia wood and covered in gold, measuring approximately 4 feet long, 2 feet wide and 2 feet high, the ark was topped with a mercy seat of pure gold. Upon this lid sat the cherubim facing each other with wings outstretched, creating a space between them where God's presence would descend. The choice of acacia wood is particularly significant from an esoteric perspective. In ancient Near Eastern symbolism, certain woods were considered sacred and connected to the divine realm. Acacia trees grew in harsh desert conditions, their deep roots reaching down to hidden water sources, making them symbols of life persisting in deathly environments. This connects directly to the tree of life imagery that permeates ancient mythology, including the biblical Garden of Eden. The tree that can access hidden waters and survive in the wilderness becomes a perfect material for housing divine presence. The gold covering represents incorruptibility and divine light, transforming the mortal wood into something eternal. This combination of earthly material transformed by divine metal mirrors the esoteric concept of spiritual alchemy, where base matter is elevated to its highest potential through contact with the sacred. The cherubim adorning the ark's lid demand special attention in our investigation of pagan origins. In biblical Hebrew, these beings are called Q, a word whose etymology remains debated but shows intriguing connections to other ancient Near Eastern cultures. The Assyrians had Karabu protective spirits depicted as winged beings with human or animal features that guarded sacred spaces and temples. The Babylonians employed similar protective figures at temple entrances and on sacred objects. Even more fascinating is the connection to ancient Egyptian symbolism. The goddess Isis and her sister Nephthys were often depicted with outstretched wings protecting sacred objects, particularly the canopic shrine of Tut, which bears a striking resemblance to the biblical description of the ark. These Egyptian goddesses would kneel, facing each other with wings extended over the sacred container, just as the cherubim do on the mercy seat. This parallel is not coincidental when we remember that the Israelites, according to biblical narrative, spent generations in Egypt before the Exodus. The cultural exchange and symbolic borrowing would have been inevitable. However, the Hebrew tradition transformed these protective deities into servants of the one God, removing their individual divine status while maintaining their guardian function. The concept of a sacred container housing divine presence or power appears repeatedly across ancient cultures. In ancient Egypt, the bark of the gods, elaborated shrine boats carried in procession, served a similar function to the ark. These portable shrines contained statues of deities and were carried on poles by priests, just as the ark was carried by Levites using poles inserted through rings on its sides. The bark of Amun-Ra, processed during religious festivals, was understood as a throne where the god's presence would manifest during the journey. Priests would never touch the bark directly, using the carrying poles to maintain separation between the sacred object and profane contact. This practice mirrors exactly the biblical prohibition against touching the ark, as demonstrated tragically in the story of Uzzah, who reached out to steady the ark and was struck dead for his arrest. The parallel extends to the belief that these objects possessed inherent divine power that could be dangerous to the uninitiated or impure. This was not merely symbolic, but understood as a real metaphysical force that required proper ritual preparation to approach safely. In Mesopotamian tradition, we find similar concepts of divine presence residing in sacred objects. The tablets of destiny, clay tablets inscribed with the fates of all things, were kept in heavily guarded sanctums and considered supremely powerful. Whoever possessed these tablets controlled the order of the cosmos itself. Various Mesopotamian myths describe conflicts between gods over possession of these tablets, recognizing that control of this sacred object meant control of divine authority. The biblical Ark, containing the tablets of the law written by God's own finger, serves a remarkably similar function. It represents not just divine presence but divine order, the foundation of cosmic and social law. The Ten Commandments inscribed on stone echo the Mesopotamian concept of divine law, made manifest in physical form. Both traditions understand that when the divine will is written down and housed in a sacred container, that object becomes a nexus of supernatural power. The stone tablets themselves connect to even older concepts of sacred stones as dwelling places of divinity. Throughout the ancient Near East, standing stones, boundary markers, and carved stelae were understood as places where the divine intersected with the physical world. The stone held the divine word, making it more than mere rock, but a conduit between heaven and earth. The inner contents of the ark provide further layers of symbolic meaning when examined through comparative mythology. Aaron's rod that budded represents an ancient symbol of divine selection and authority. The image of a dead wooden staff suddenly sprouting leaves and flowers appears in various mythological traditions as proof of supernatural favor. In Greek mythology, we encounter similar imagery when Dionysus causes ivy to grow from his thirsty staff, demonstrating his divine nature. The Norse god Odin hung his spear Gungnir on Yggdrasil, the world tree, connecting his authority to the cosmic axis. The budding rod represents the union of death and life, the dry wood brought back to vitality through divine power. This symbolism directly connects to the tree of life concept, where a source of supernatural vitality can resurrect what appears dead. Aaron's staff, a piece of dead wood brought back to flowering life, serves as a miniature version of the tree of life itself, preserved within the ark as proof of God's life-giving power. This symbol would have resonated deeply with ancient peoples who understood trees as connections between the underworld, middle world, and heavens, their roots reaching into the realm of the dead while their branches stretch toward the divine. The pot of manna stored in the ark carries its own rich symbolic weight. Manna, the miraculous bread that fell from heaven during the Israelites' wilderness wandering, represents divine sustenance and providence. In broader mythological context, we can see connections to other traditions of magical food that sustains beyond natural limits. The Greek ambrosia, food of the gods that granted immortality, serves a similar symbolic function as supernatural nourishment. Norse mythology speaks of the apples of Idun, which kept the gods young and vital. In all these traditions, magical food represents more than physical sustenance. It symbolizes the divine essence that maintains life and prevents decay. The preservation of manna in the ark, bread that normally spoiled after a single day but was kept incorrupt within the sacred container, demonstrates the ark's power to suspend natural law. This connects to the broader theme of the ark as a space where normal physical rules do not apply, where the divine realm imposes its own order. The manna itself was described as appearing like coriander seed, white in color, and tasting like honey wafers. The whiteness suggests purity and divine origin, while the honey flavor connects to ancient associations of honey, a sacred substance used in religious rituals across multiple cultures. When we examine the function of the ark in biblical narrative, we discover it served as far more than a mere storage container. It was understood as the footstool of God's invisible throne, the point of contact between the divine and human realms. This concept of an object or place serving as an axis mundi, a cosmic axis connecting different levels of reality, appears throughout ancient religious thought. The Mesopotamian ziggurat served this function, a mountain-like structure where gods could descend to earth. The Egyptian Benben stone, a pyramidion-shaped sacred rock, was believed to be the first land to emerge from the primordial waters and thus a connection point between chaos and order. Mount Olympus in Greek tradition, Mount Meru in Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, and Yggdrasil in Norse mythology all serve as cosmic centers where different planes of existence connect. The ark functioned as a portable version of this concept, a mobile cosmic center that traveled with the Israelites. Whatever the ark rested became, temporarily, the center of the world, the point where heaven touched earth. This portability was revolutionary in ancient religious thought, suggesting that divine presence was not tied to a specific geographic location, but could move with the people. The power attributed to the ark in biblical accounts further reveals its connection to older concepts of sacred objects as weapons and protective talismans. When the Israelites carried the ark into battle, They believed it would guarantee victory through God's direct intervention. This belief was dramatically challenged when the Ark was captured by the Philistines after a disastrous battle at Aphek, however. The subsequent narrative describes how the Ark brought calamity to its captors, causing the statue of their god Dagon to fall prostrate and shatter, and afflicting the Philistines with tumors until they returned it. This story mirrors ancient Near Eastern concepts of divine combat, where gods would battle through their sacred images and symbols. A captured cult statue did not mean the god was defeated, but rather that the god was testing or punishing their own people. The Ark's behavior in Philistine territory demonstrates this principle, showing that even in enemy hands, it retained autonomous divine power. This understanding of sacred objects as containing active rather than passive divine presence appears across ancient cultures. Egyptian temple statues underwent daily rituals of feeding and clothing because they were understood as living presences, not mere representations. The placement of the Ark within the tabernacle reveals another layer of esoteric symbolism that connects biblical tradition to broader ancient cosmological concepts. The tabernacle itself was designed according to precise divine instructions given to Moses on Mount Sinai, creating a three-part structure that mirrored ancient Near Eastern temple architecture and cosmic symbolism. The outer courtyard represented the earthly realm, accessible to the Israelite people for sacrifice and ritual purity. The holy place, accessible only to priests, contained the menorah, the table of showbread, and the altar of incense, representing an intermediate zone between earth and heaven. Finally, the Holy of Holies, separated by a thick veil and housing only the Ark, represented the divine throne room itself, the innermost sanctum where heaven and earth met. This three-part structure was not unique to Israelite religion, but reflected a widespread ancient understanding of sacred space as reflecting cosmic order. The Egyptian temples followed similar patterns, with increasingly restricted areas leading to the innermost shrine where the god's statue resided. Mesopotamian ziggurats embodied the same principle vertically, with successive platforms leading to the divine dwelling at the summit. The tabernacle represented this cosmic architecture in portable form, a miniature universe that could be assembled and disassembled as the Israelites journeyed. The dimensions and proportions of the tabernacle and Ark encoded sacred geometry that appears across ancient religious structures. The Ark's measurements, given in cubits, follow ratios that create what esoteric traditions call divine proportions. The ratio of length to width to height creates mathematical relationships that ancient cultures believed reflected cosmic harmony. This is not merely aesthetic preference, but represents a deeper belief that the universe itself is structured according to mathematical principles, and sacred objects must mirror these proportions to properly function as conduits of divine power. The Pythagorean school in ancient Greece, though later than the Exodus, preserves similar beliefs about sacred mathematics and proportion in temple architecture. The golden ratio, appearing in nature and used in sacred architecture from Egypt to Greece, represents this understanding that certain proportions connect the material world to underlying cosmic order. While we cannot definitively prove the Ark's dimensions intentionally employed the golden ratio, the principle of sacred proportion in religious architecture was widespread throughout the ancient Near East. The very precision of the biblical measurements suggests that these dimensions were not arbitrary but carried symbolic weight. The veils separating the Holy of Holies from the holy place deserve special attention in our exploration of pagan symbolism. This massive curtain was woven with images of cherubim, creating a barrier that was simultaneously physical and symbolic. The cherubim depicted on the veil mirrored those atop the Ark, creating layers of angelic guardianship around the divine presence. This imagery directly connects to the biblical account of the Garden of Eden, where cherubim with flaming swords were stationed at the eastern gate after the expulsion of Adam and Eve, preventing return to the tree of life. The parallel is unmistakable. The cherubim guard access to the divine presence and the source of immortality, whether in Eden or in the tabernacle. This connection reveals the Ark as symbolically linked to the Eden narrative, representing what was lost when humanity fell from grace. The Holy of Holies becomes, in effect, a reconstruction of Eden, a space where divine presence and human realm can still intersect under strictly controlled conditions. The high priest entering once yearly on Yom Kippur reenacting Ritual formed the access to divine presence that humanity lost at the fall. The blood sacrifice he carries represents the price required to bridge the gap between holy God and fallen humanity. The cherubim as guardians appear in various forms throughout ancient Near Eastern mythology, but their role as protectors of sacred trees or divine thrones is particularly relevant. In Mesopotamian iconography, winged beings guard the sacred tree. Often depicted in palace reliefs from Assyrian and Babylonian periods, these protective spirits, sometimes human-headed, sometimes flank stylized trees that represent cosmic order and divine blessing. The tree they protect is understood as the axis connecting the underworld, earth, and heavens, the source of fertility and life. This imagery predates the biblical text by centuries, suggesting a common symbolic language across the ancient Near East. The cherubim in Eden, stationed to guard the way to the tree of life, fit perfectly into this broader tradition. They're not merely arbitrary mythological creatures, but represent a specific symbolic function, preventing unauthorized access to the source of immortality and divine knowledge. The tree of life and tree of knowledge in Eden, though distinct in the biblical text, both represent dangerous divine secrets that must be protected from unprepared humanity. The cherubim serve as the ultimate gatekeepers, ensuring that only those properly purified and authorized may approach the sacred mystery. This brings us to one of the most provocative connections in our investigation, the relationship between the ark and the serpent. Symbolism of Eden, at first glance, these might seem contradictory elements, with the serpent representing rebellion and the ark representing divine order. However, deeper examination reveals complex symbolic relationships. The bronze serpent that Moses constructed in the wilderness, as recorded in the book of Numbers, provides a crucial link. When the Israelites were dying from serpent bites, God commanded Moses to create a bronze serpent and raise it on a pole. Anyone who looked upon this serpent would be healed. This brazen serpent was later kept in the temple alongside other sacred objects until King Hezekiah destroyed it because the people had begun worshipping it. The symbolism here is multi-layered. A serpent, traditionally associated with the fall and deception, becomes an instrument of healing and salvation when properly elevated and viewed. This mirrors ancient Near Eastern understanding of serpent symbolism as fundamentally ambiguous, representing both danger and healing, poison and medicine. The caduceus symbol, two serpents wound around a staff, appears in ancient Mesopotamian iconography thousands of years before Moses, representing healing and divine wisdom. The Egyptian uraeus, the cobra symbol of sovereignty worn on the pharaoh's crown, represented protective power and divine authority. The connection between serpent wisdom and the ark becomes even more intriguing when we consider esoteric interpretations of the Eden narrative. In various mystical traditions, both Jewish and pagan, the serpent in Eden represents not simple evil, but dangerous knowledge, gnosis that humanity was not ready to receive. The serpent offers divinity through knowledge, telling Eve that eating the forbidden fruit will make them like God, knowing good and evil. This promise is not entirely false. God himself confirms after the fall that humans have indeed become like the divine ones in this knowledge. The danger was not that the serpent lied, but that humanity grasped for divine knowledge without divine authorization through rebellion rather than grace. In Gnostic traditions, which flourished in the early centuries of the Common Era but drew on older esoteric currents, the serpent in Eden is sometimes portrayed positively as a liberator bringing secret knowledge to imprisoned humanity. While this interpretation directly contradicts orthodox biblical theology, it reveals the complex symbolic terrain we are navigating. The Ark, containing the tablets of divine law, represents authorized knowledge, wisdom given through proper channels under proper conditions. It is the serpents offered transformed and sanctified, divine knowledge made accessible through obedience rather than rebellion. Ancient mystery religions throughout the Mediterranean and Near East featured sacred objects and initiation rituals that bear structural similarities to the Ark's function. The Eleusinian mysteries in Greece, though geographically distant, revealed patterns that help us understand the cultural context. Initiates into these mysteries would undergo ritual purification, experience symbolic death and rebirth, and encounter sacred objects whose nature was strictly guarded. The revelation of these sacred objects at the climax of the initiation was understood to convey transformative knowledge and ensure blessed afterlife. While we have no evidence of direct connection between Israelite practices and Greek mysteries, both reflect ancient Near Eastern patterns of controlled access to sacred knowledge through ritual preparation. The high priest entering the Holy of Holies follows a similar structure. Ritual purification through bathing in special garments, symbolic approach to the boundary between life and death, since touching the ark improperly meant instant death, an encounter with the divine presence manifesting between the cherubim. The knowledge or experience gained was ineffable, not to be shared with the uninitiated, much like mystery cult revelations. The concept of the ark as a throne or footstool deserves deeper exploration in light of ancient throne symbolism. Throughout the ancient Near East, royal thrones incorporate a complex symbolism connecting earthly kingship to divine authority. Egyptian pharaonic thrones featured protective deities on the sides, similar to the cherubim flanking the ark's mercy seat. Mesopotamian thrones were understood as earthly manifestations of celestial kingship, with elaborate rituals surrounding who could approach or sit upon them. The ark functions as an empty throne, the invisible God's seat of power on earth. This concept of divine invisible presence ruling from a throne where no image sits was revolutionary in the ancient world. Where gods were typically represented through statues and visible images, the closest parallel might be found in the Phoenician tradition of the empty throne representing Baal, though even this comparison has limitations. The ark's revolutionary aspect was combining this invisible divine presence with portable mobility. Most ancient thrones, whether earthly or divine, were fixed in palaces or temples. The ark traveled, making it simultaneously more accessible and more mysterious. It could appear at any location, transforming that place temporarily into the cosmic center, the point where divine will intersect with earthly reality. The materials used in the ark's construction carry symbolic weight beyond mere practicality. Gold, as mentioned earlier, represented incorruptibility and divine light across ancient cultures. In Egyptian tradition, gold was considered the flesh of the gods, particularly associated with the sun god Ra. Alchemical traditions, which emerged from ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian magical practices, understood gold as the perfected state of matter, the goal of the great work of transformation. The ark's golden covering thus represents not just divine glory, but the transformation of ordinary matter into its highest spiritual potential. The acacia wood beneath connects to desert survival and hidden life sources, but also to the broader symbolism of sacred trees. Various cultures had particular trees considered especially holy or magically potent. The Celtic Druids revered oak groves, Greek worship centered on sacred olive trees, and Mesopotamian mythology featured the hulupu tree from which Inanna crafted her throne and bed. The choice of acacia connects the ark to this ancient tradition of sacred wood as conduit between earthly and divine realms. The wood grows from earth, reaching toward heaven, its grain a physical record of years of growth and survival. Covered in eternal gold, the mortal wood becomes immortalized, time suspended in divine presence. The ark's rings and carrying poles encode another layer of symbolic meaning, often overlooked in surface readings. The poles inserted through rings on the ark's sides were never to be removed. Even when the ark rested in the tabernacle or later in Solomon's temple, this permanent readiness for movement reminds us that divine presence, while it might dwell among humanity, is never captured or controlled. The God of Israel could not be bound to one location, unlike the local deities of Canaan tied to specific high places and groves. This theological concept of divine transcendence and freedom manifested physically in the ark's design. The carrying poles also served a practical sacred function. They maintained the necessary separation between holy object and human contact. The death of Uzzah for touching the ark, though seeming harsh to modern sensibilities, reflects ancient understanding that holiness was not merely moral purity but a tangible force that required proper insulation. This concept appears across ancient religions. Certain objects, places, or times were understood as charged with spiritual power that could be dangerous to approach incorrectly. The Roman concept of sake referred to things sacred in a way that made them both holy and dangerous, set apart and potentially deadly. The poles functioned as ritual insulators, allowing human servants to move divine power without direct contact. The disappearance of the Ark of the Covenant from historical record adds yet another layer of mystery and symbolic meaning to its legacy. According to biblical narrative, the Ark was placed in Solomon's temple around the 10th century BCE, where it remained in the Holy of Holies for nearly 4 centuries. The last definitive biblical mention of the Ark appears during the reign of King Josiah, who commanded the Levites to return it to the temple, suggesting it had been moved for safekeeping during troubled times. After this reference, the Ark vanishes from Scripture. When the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and the first temple in 586 BCE, no mention is made of the Ark's capture or destruction, unlike the detailed descriptions of other temple treasures being carried off to Babylon. This silence has spawned countless theories and legends about the Ark's fate. Some Jewish traditions suggest the prophet Jeremiah hid the Ark in a cave on Mount Nebo before the Babylonian invasion. Ethiopian Christian tradition claims the Ark resides in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum, brought there by Menthik, son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Other theories place it in hidden chambers beneath the Temple Mount, in caves near the Dead Sea, or even in locations as distant as Ireland or Zimbabwe. The Ark's disappearance transforms it from a physical object into pure symbol, an eternal mystery that can never be fully possessed or comprehended. The symbolic significance of the ark's loss resonates deeply with the Eden narrative. Just as humanity lost the access to the tree of life through disobedience, Israel lost the visible manifestation of divine presence through unfaithfulness to the covenant. The prophets interpreted the Babylonian exile as divine judgment for breaking the law that the ark contained. Creating a bitter irony, the very tablets commanding faithfulness to God became unreachable because of failure to obey those commands. This pattern of loss and seeking echoes throughout mythology. The Greek hero Jason sought the golden fleece, a sacred ram skin with magical properties that could only be obtained through great trials. The Grail legends of medieval Europe describe knights seeking the cup used at the Last Supper, a sacred vessel that confers divine grace but remains hidden from the unworthy. These quest narratives all share a common structure. A sacred object connected to divine power is lost and must be sought through spiritual purification and heroic effort. The Ark becomes the ultimate object of this archetypal quest, representing not just a physical artifact but the restoration of right relationship between humanity and the divine. The search for the lost Ark mirrors humanity's search for the lost paradise of Eden. Both quests ultimately pointing towards spiritual transformation rather than mere recovery of physical objects. When we examine later Jewish mystical traditions, particularly Kabbalah, we find interpretations of the Ark that connect it explicitly to Eden symbolism and the Tree of Life. Kabbalistic thought, which emerged in medieval times but claims to preserve ancient esoteric traditions, describes the Sephiro, 10 emanations or attributes through which the infinite divine manifests in creation. These Sephiro are often diagrammed as the Tree of Life, a geometric pattern showing how divine energy flows from transcendent source into material reality. In this sistine, the Ark represents the meeting point between different levels of divine emanation, particularly the union of masculine and feminine aspects of the divine. The mercy seat, where divine presence manifested between the cherubim, corresponds to the Sephiro called Tiferet, representing beauty and balanced harmony. This position on the Kabbalistic tree sits at the center, mediating between higher spiritual realms and lower material worlds. The two cherubim represent the pillars of mercy and severity, feminine and masculine, receptive and active principles that must be balanced for divine presence to manifest. While Kabbalah developed long after the biblical period, it may preserve symbolic understanding that circulated in oral tradition among Jewish mystics. More relevant to our investigation, Kabbalistic interpretation reveals how the Ark naturally invites connection to Tree of Life symbolism. Both representing the axis between heaven and earth, the connection between the Ark and the serpent reaches its fullest symbolic expression when we consider the Kundalini concept in Eastern esoteric traditions and its parallels in Western occultism. Kundalini refers to spiritual energy visualized as a coiled serpent at the base of the spine that, when awakened through proper practice, rises through energy centers called chakras until reaching enlightenment at the crown of the head. This serpent power represents latent divine potential within each person, dangerous if awakened improperly, but transformative when properly channeled. The parallel to the Eden serpent and the Ark becomes apparent. Forbidden knowledge, accessed through improper means, brings death, but the same divine wisdom accessed through proper ritual and purification brings life and transformation. The brazen serpent Moses raised in the wilderness bridges these concepts perfectly. The deadly serpent becomes the healing serpent when elevated and viewed correctly, just as the dangerous serpent knowledge of Eden becomes sanctified wisdom when approached through authorized channels. The Ark, containing the authorized revelation of divine law, represents the transformation of serpentine gnosis from rebellious grasping to grateful receiving. This is not syncretism with Eastern religion, but recognition of common symbolic patterns that emerge from human spiritual experience across cultures. The replacement of the physical Ark with spiritual presence in post-exilic Jewish thought, and later in Christian theology, represents another transformation of the symbol. After the Babylonian exile, when Jews returned to Jerusalem and rebuilt the temple under Persian sponsorship, the Second Temple's Holy of Holies stood empty. No Ark occupied the sacred space where divine glory had once manifested. The high priest continued to enter once yearly on Yom Kippur, performing rituals in an empty room where memory replaced presence. This absence became theologically significant, forcing a shift from physical to spiritual understanding of divine dwelling. The prophet Jeremiah had predicted that, in the coming age, people would no longer speak of the Ark because God's law would be written on human hearts rather than stone tablets. This internalization of the covenant transformed the Ark from external object to internal reality. Christianity took this interpretation further. with New Testament writers presenting Jesus as the fulfillment of ark symbolism. The Gospel of John describes Jesus as the Word made flesh, divine presence dwelling among humanity. The book of Hebrews explicitly compares Jesus to the high priest entering the Holy of Holies, but entering heaven itself rather than an earthly sanctuary. Mary, mother of Jesus, is sometimes interpreted as the ark in Christian typology, carrying within her womb the divine presence that the ark once contained. These theological developments transform the ark from lost artifact to living symbol, its physical absence enabling its spiritual omnipresence. The archaeological search for the ark in modern times reveals how ancient symbols continue to exert power over contemporary imagination. Numerous expeditions have sought the ark in locations suggested by various traditions. These searches blend legitimate archaeology with religious fervor and sometimes outright fantasy. The famous archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon excavated extensively in Jerusalem but found no trace of the ark. The explorer Vendell Jones searched the caves near Qumran, believing Dead Sea Scroll references pointed to the ark's location. Ron Wyatt claimed to have found the ark in a cave beneath gold, though his claims lack credible archaeological support and have been rejected by professional archaeologists and biblical scholars. The Ethiopian claim remains intriguing but unverifiable, as the supposed guardian monk allows no one to view the object, and the church has not permitted scientific examination. What these searches reveal is less about the ark's actual location and more about its symbolic power. The ark represents ultimate sacred mystery, the key to unlocking divine secrets. Finding it would supposedly validate religious claims, prove historical narratives, and reconnect modern believers to ancient divine presence. This quest reflects the same human longing that drove ancient mystery cults, the desire to encounter the sacred directly, to move beyond faith into tangible proof. The ark's connection to the Eden narrative reaches its culmination when we recognize both as symbols of the same spiritual reality, the possibility and peril of human encounter with the divine. Eden represents the original state of human access to divine presence, symbolized by free access to the tree of life and direct communication with God. The fall represents the rupture of this intimacy, with cherubim guarding the way back to the tree. The ark represents the partial restoration of this access, under carefully controlled conditions. The cherubim no longer bar the way but frame the space where divine presence can manifest, transformed from guards preventing access to attendants facilitating it. The high priest entering the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur becomes a new Adam, temporarily restored to Eden under conditions of ritual purity and sacrificial atonement. The blood he brings from the sacrifice represents the price of this access, the recognition that fallen humanity cannot approach holy divinity casually. Yet the access remains possible, the relationship not permanently severed. The ark thus functions as a doorway, a portal between the world as it is and the world as it was meant to be, between exile from Eden and eventual return to paradise. This interpretation helps explain why the ark's physical presence ultimately became unnecessary. The symbol fulfilled its purpose by teaching Israel that divine presence remained accessible, despite human failure, and that restoration required proper approach through ritual, sacrifice, and moral obedience. When the ark disappeared, the lesson remained. Access to the sacred requires transformation of the seeker, not merely possession of sacred objects. Various wisdom traditions across cultures teach similar principles. The alchemical great work sought to transform lead into gold, but esoteric interpretation understood this as symbolic of transforming the base human soul into spiritual perfection. The philosopher Stone that supposedly accomplished this transformation was not a physical object but a state of consciousness Gnosis achieved through long spiritual discipline. Similarly, the Grail in later medieval legend becomes less important as a physical cup and more significant, a symbol of spiritual quests and transformation. The ark belongs to this category of sacred objects whose physical existence matters less than their symbolic function. Whether the ark still exists hidden in some cave or a temple basement, or was destroyed millennia ago, its reality as spiritual symbol remains undiminished. The pagan elements we have traced throughout this investigation do not undermine the biblical account, but rather reveal its richness and depth. Ancient Israel did not exist in cultural vacuum, but participated in the symbolic language of the ancient Near East, transforming and elevating these symbols to express monotheistic theology. The cherubim, the sacred container, the portable throne, the axis mundi function, the tree symbolism, the serpent associations, all these elements drew from the deep well of ancient religious imagery while being pressed into service of a revolutionary religious vision. The God of Israel was not one God among many, tied to one location or limited to tribal concerns, but the universal creator, transcendent yet choosing to dwell among humanity, accessible yet demanding holiness. The Ark embodied these paradoxes, divine presence in portable form. Awesome power requiring insulation, visible symbol of invisible reality. By understanding the Ark's connections to older and surrounding religious traditions, we do not diminish its significance, but rather appreciate how profoundly it transformed these traditions, how it took familiar symbols and infused them with new meaning, pointing toward the ethical monotheism that would reshape human religious consciousness. The ultimate revelation of the Ark's mystery may be that it points beyond itself to truths that cannot be contained in any object, however sacred. The Ark contained the law, but the law was meant to be written on hearts. The Ark manifested divine presence, but God's presence could not be limited to one object or place. The Ark connected to Eden and the tree of life, but the return to paradise requires transformation of human nature, not mere recovery of lost artifacts. In this sense, the Ark's disappearance becomes theologically necessary, even providential. As long as the physical Ark existed, there remained the temptation to mistake symbol for reality, to believe that possessing the sacred object meant possessing divine favor. Its loss forced a deeper understanding. The divine presence it symbolized was never truly containable. The access it represented was always meant to be internalized, and the paradise it pointed toward was always a future hope rather than a recoverable past. The Ark thus becomes a perfect symbol precisely in its absence, teaching through loss what it once taught through presence, that the sacred mystery at the heart of existence can be approached but never fully grasped, known but never completely comprehended, sought eternally but only found through the transformation of the seeker rather than the discovery of any object, however holy.